Hello, I'm Tom Bailey, and in today's Speaker Stories episode, I'll be getting to know Joe Leech, who is a trusted advisor and coach to CEOs of startups, high growth tech, and Fortune and FTSE 100 companies. So, Joe, hello, and a very warm welcome to today's episode.
Hi, Tom. Good to be here.
Thanks so much for joining. And just out of interest, whereabouts are you in the world right now?
Yeah, so now I live in Dorset on the south coast of the UK, so partway between Lyme Regis and Weymouth, so right at the bottom of the UK. We
Fantastic. And a
talk
lovely
about
part of
living
the
on the
world.
edge of the UK. Yeah, lovely down here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. Thank you so much. And I also know that you're the host of Make Better Decisions, the podcast, and are also a keynote speaker. So I wanted to begin by asking a question around how important has public speaking been for you in your career to date?
Do you know what? It's a good question, and it's ebbed and it's flowed for me really.
Yeah, of course.
So I definitely thought for a long time that it was my superpower, and that it generated me all the work that in the world that I needed. But the reality is most recently I'm not so sure actually. It's been an interesting journey trying to figure out where public speaking fit into what I do and
Mm,
who I am really. So yeah, yes and no for me
yes.
in terms of success and usefulness for me. But it'll be
Yeah,
interesting to explore that and chat to you about that today anyway.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think the best place to start for me is right at the beginning, actually. So what's one of your earliest memories of having to stand up and deliver a presentation or do some form of public speaking?
Yeah, so I remember it really the first time I had to do it is actually when I went to university. The school I went at wasn't great.
No.
When I went to university, it was in my first year. I had to give a presentation. I studied neuroscience at university, which was very impressive when you talk to people at parties, but not
Mhm.
easy and not particularly practical really in the real
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And I had to give a presentation on the human brain in my first year, and I was awful, like awful. And I didn't quite know why I was awful because I've good conversationalist. I can have a great chat to people, but I
Mhm.
didn't when I kind of basically got up in front of the group. I didn't know what to say. I stuttered. I just didn't really have a proper format for what I was doing. I thought I could just kind of just get up there and kind of do it. Really, I had some cards with talking points on, and I had some overhead projector slides, which shows how old I am, some acetates with some
Yeah.
images and stuff. But I was just awful, and it really stuck with me how bad I was at it and how much I was really dreadful.
And
But I thought I was going to be great, and so I went first, and I wasn't, and then everybody else who went after me was much better than me. And yes, it was
and and
a
and from that point, was the thought process, I'm never going to do that again, or was it, I need to get better at that?
yeah, it was. I'm not going to do that again. I just assumed I was bad at it, and I
Mhm.
thought it's either one of these things. You've either got it or you haven't. And I just thought, well, that's it then. It's something I'm never going to do again. I thought I could do it, and actually, no, I can't. And so I put the whole kind of public speaking thing on hold, and that was sort of me at 18. Didn't think that I could ever do it again, and that was it. I thought I'm done with it.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And I guess for a lot of people, they'll never pick that back up. And that one moment, that
Yeah,
fear, that feeling of imposter syndrome,
it's
it will
horrible.
stay with them for the rest of their life, and they'll miss
Oh,
out on.
it was horrible. And I think what was interesting is you're right. That was the first time the imposter syndrome. I call my imposter syndrome imp. I even have a name for my imposter
Yeah.
syndrome. It's the first time it really hit me, and it was. I'll never forget that feeling. It was absolutely frightening, and not a feeling I'd was expecting to have as well. I just kind of went up, was like, oh, this is bad, and it really has stuck with me. And yeah, I did get over it though. So
But good to
it's an
reflect
awesome
back
thing.
though. And I guess the one thing I'd like to ask on the back of that is, if you could, what you know now, if you could go back and put an arm around young Joe and say, hey, here's my advice to you right now in the moment, what advice would that be, do you think?
That's a very good question. I don't know what I'd say to that person then really, as I think it part of the journey was not knowing necessarily what to do next. I think was interesting for me at that point is I think what I'd have said to myself was kind of, it will be okay. You will figure it out. You
Yeah.
will get better at this. That instinct that you kind of had that you can do this was right. That fear that you had, that imposter syndrome, actually, in reality, is your superpower. The fact that you got up and you were nervous and you were scared is actually in the future what's going to make you a lot better and make you a great public speaker in the end was the fact that you were nervous at this point in your life and that you do have imposter syndrome for when it comes to speaking.
I've seen that a lot with these interviews. A lot of the people I speak to, are speakers because they were bad speakers to begin with. You know, it gave them more drive and determination to become a better speaker, and it ultimately led them to where they are today. So I think, yeah, young Joe should definitely take that advice on board.
Absolutely.
And what about your journey since then? Have there been any big speaking disasters where you've questioned whether or not this is still the right thing to do, or has it been a fairly straightforward
Yeah.
journey?
Oh, I mean, I've had many kind of disasters with it, really. What was interesting for me though is what really gave me the confidence to know that I could do it again was I was a teacher. I retrained as a teacher.
Mhm.
Not kind of, I wasn't a state school teacher. I trained myself as an English language teacher. So I
Yeah.
went and did a course for sort of 6 weeks. And because it was such an intense 6 week course, they had to kind of teach you to be a teacher in a very short amount of time. And one of the most interesting approaches they used, which was actually quite horrific and quite scary at the time, was you would do a teaching, you'd all teach in the morning. So there'd be like 5 of you in your little group. You'd all teach in the morning. Then in the afternoon, you'd all watch
Mm. Yeah.
videotapes of the lessons. You'd watch the video of you all teaching, and you'd all critique each other, really.
Yeah.
And that for me was the way that I got better much faster, is that we did this every day for 6 weeks. Is we would teach in the morning, and then in the evenings, in the afternoons, we'd then look at our teaching and look how we could improve it. And we'd look at ourselves, how we spoke, and again with English language teaching, because clarity is really important when you speak, we kind of learned not to use the ums and the ahs and the hesitations. It was a great way of getting faster in a quite protective, safe space with other people who were also on that same journey to improve their teaching skills. And I ultimately went on to teach kids. Everybody else I was on that course with went to teach adults, and I went to teach kids, which was again similarly very challenging, because kids are quite unforgiving of teachers, as we all know. We've all been there.
Mhm.
And that taught me a lot about public speaking, was a lot about projecting confidence. And if your audience can detect a slight amount of uncomfortableness in you, teenagers will absolutely take advantage of that. But
Of
then
course.
we've all been there when we've watched people giving speeches and doing public speaking. If they're a little bit uncomfortable, we feel that uncomfortableness on their behalf, and it's quite difficult often to watch somebody. So
Mhm.
that was the biggest thing for me, was learning how to project confidence, even when there wasn't any confidence underneath.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't, then those teenagers would absolutely rip you to shreds.
And just out of interest then, so anybody listening that is a speaker or maybe a starter speaker, maybe they feel like they don't yet have that confidence. What advice would you give to them to help them have more power, more presence, more authority when they speak?
Um, my question and my thoughts are, really the way I did it was to watch tapes
Yeah.
of myself speaking. So you like, we've got it like a webcam, you just practice yourself. But the thing you've got to get over is you've got to watch yourself speaking back. So you watch a video of you doing it, and you look at the mistakes you made, what worked well, what didn't work, but you're comfortably criticizing yourself,
Mhm.
which is honestly, it's horrible at
Mm.
first, but it's the
Yeah.
way you want to get better, is you just practice by watching yourself and understanding where you make mistakes and not giving up. But that, for me, that was the best way to get better, was to critique myself. And if possible, if you can find a buddy or a group of you that can do that with each other, where you all watch each other speaking, that's a comfortable place to fail, because there's nothing like failing in front of some friends and having a good laugh about it.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned disasters. I've fallen off the stage before,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And that is the kind of the worst nightmare. Well, I mean, the worst nightmare is actually, you're turning up and you're naked. I've never quite been there, but I
No.
have fallen off the back of a stage before, and I've had my laptop crash out in all my slides. I've got an hour's keynote. I've got no slides. Yeah, you learn from it going badly.
Yeah. And I guess it's just knowing that those things will happen. If you want to go down this road, this as a speaker, there will be things that come up. So it's just making sure you're prepared mentally, but also having backups as well.
Definitely. I mean, the thing for me was the first time that I walked into a classroom as a teacher, I'm like, oh, this was not the class I was expecting to teach. I was expecting to teach these kids tomorrow. Hold on a minute. I've not got a lesson prepared. I've got 90 minutes with this group of teenagers. Oh dear. And at that point, it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. That's easy for me to say, having been through it, but it never is. Is if you can tell a story, if you can recover, if you can sort of not if you can deal with a challenge. So the biggest thing is mistakes will happen. It's how you recover from those mistakes that kind of makes the difference between a nervous bad speaker and a great speaker. It's just knowing this will happen and just recovering from it.
That's great. And I guess a lot of people who want to go on this journey but decide not to is because they're too worried about what mistakes and what issues might come up along the way. But I guess know that they are going to happen and they are part of the journey. And just go at it.
Just go for it. The time I fell off the stage was, I thought, that's going to be humiliating, right? So, because I was talking, not really looking at the big screen behind me, my arms were out. I was not really looking where I was going, and I sort of misstepped, stumbled a couple of steps, and fell through the curtain at the back, and there just wasn't, and I fell off the stage. And of course, initially people were like, there's a shock of people, oh, has he hurt himself? Followed by a sort of an element of nervous laughter. And then I sort of stood up and put my arms in the air as if I was okay, and everybody cheered. That's not what I expected to happen. Do you know what I mean? I thought it was going to be embarrassing, but the very fact that I kind of got up and put my arms in the air, people were relieved that I was okay. And what was interesting about humor generally is I mentioned my roots in neuroscience. Is humor comes from, it evolved from kind of a diffusing of a difficult situation. So diffusing of an awkward situation, diffusing of over emotion, is as humans developed humor to overcome difficult, challenging situations. And actually that was really helpful to me once I understood where humor came from, to understand again how humor can help you when you are on stage as well. Because again, a lot of people think they have to be funny and don't know how to be funny. And part of that journey for me was falling off the stage. Was a point where I realized that, hey, I can be humorous.
I love
even
that.
if that wasn't particularly planned.
Of course, yeah. One thing I want to go into is a lot of speakers that I meet on this podcast tell me that it's really important to have a topic, a niche, and quite defined niche that you talk about. How do you find that as a speaker? Is it just based on your experiences, or do you choose it and go after it? How do you tend to find those?
That's a good question. Yeah, you need to have your shtick. You need to have something that differentiates you from everybody else. And the challenge you have, certainly again, I have the imposter syndrome. This is where imposter syndrome rears its ugly head. Is as soon as you feel like you've got a niche or a specialty, your imposter syndrome, my imp comes up and says, well, that's not really a specialty. Everybody's talking about that. I know at least 5 speakers that speak about that subject far better than me. And the real eye-opener for me with my speaking came when, so my background is in a kind of specialist element of design where it's applying psychology to the design of digital products. So quite specialist. And I found myself early on talking to rooms of psychologists. So people had similar backgrounds to me. So they were psychologists who moved into design and they knew the same things that I did. And so my speaking was never particularly good. And I never quite knew why. And what actually was interesting to me is when I went and spoke at a kind of a standard website design conference, how I was received was hugely different to how I was received amongst my own, what I thought were my peers. And what that really started out for me was realizing that actually what good speakers are is that they're running a kind of good import export business. Really, they're looking at a knowledge gap. They are the one-eyed man, in the land of the blind. Is what you're doing is you're taking something that the group of people you're speaking to don't know much about, and you are telling them about that. That doesn't mean you have to be an expert in that. Like I've given talks on cryptocurrency. I know nothing about cryptocurrency, but the audience I was speaking to knew absolutely nothing about that as well. So the key about finding that niche is also I would start with finding the audience. Who is your audience? Who is the perfect audience for you? And then your niche can come from that. And if you feel like you're an expert in something, then maybe you need to look for a different audience where your expertise can be proven to be useful. So again, if you're an accountant, the worst place you can speak is at an accountancy conference. The best place you can speak is at a business conference or a design conference where people want to know about the things that where there's an information gap, not to your peers where you will be putting yourself under a lot of pressure to come up with something new, interesting and innovative. And that's hard.
Yeah, that's a really nice perspective. Not many people have talked about it that way in terms of, finding the audience and making sure that you can add value to that audience as well. Because there's a knowledge gap. So I think that's a really, really good way to look at it. So for those people listening who are, so we talked about the kind of beginning of your journey. What about those people that are starting to speak, not yet paid keynote speakers? How do they then break through into that world of actually getting paid to speak rather than just speaking at their local, social clubs, for example? What's that transition point?
Yeah, it's a good question actually, and it's one I wish I'd known a little bit earlier what the secret is. And maybe my secret's not the same as everybody else's, but what I found was that was cultivating relationships with event organizers.
Of course, yeah.
That's basically it, because event organizers want they want a few things from you, right? And believe it or not, giving a great talk is not necessarily the highest point on that. What they're after is, again, event organizers, similar to the audience, they have an audience of people they sell tickets to. So they want something that's going to stimulate their audience, really. So they want a talk from you that's going to be spiky or provocative, even in its title. Okay. So they want something that's going to sell them tickets.
Yeah.
Really. And if you can sell tickets, you're going to get paid. Yeah. Simple as that. Really, that's the major difference. If you can get bums on seats, they will pay you. And what that can often mean is for speakers, there are two types of speakers. So I learned this from event organizers. There are two types of speakers. There are the names. So again, I mentioned that I work and have worked historically in the world of tech conferences. That's really been where I kind of cut my teeth. Is what was interesting is you'd find the speakers from the likes of Google and Facebook and Microsoft were the ones that were the highlight speakers. They were the ones that would be on in the middle of the day, and they'd often be the ones that people were most excited about. They'd be like, "Oh, great! It's Cheryl. She's an incredible designer at Google. I want to hear everything she has to say about that." And what you find about those people who've come from these large companies is they are not typically great public speakers, right? They will get people in there and they'll have some interesting stories about life at Google, and people are like, "Oh, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you very much." But the relevancy of that talk from somebody at Google to most people in the audience is low.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the second part of getting in with event organizers is understanding, well, really, what is it that people want to be able to take home and put into action on the Monday morning afterwards? So you've got the audience, is like, what can they get from you that means that they are furiously taking notes during your talk? What is that one thing that they can do on Monday morning? What's that aha moment that you can supply to them that the likes of Google and Facebook speakers are not going to be able to do? Yeah. The Google folks will sell tickets and they'll have interesting stories, but really what people is going to stick with people is the speaker that you should try and be, which is the speaker that gives these people something to take home and use on a Monday morning in their job or in their life, or something they can do straight away. Because that's really the second kind of speaker, is the speaker that is life-changing or career-changing, rather than having worked for Google or Amazon or Facebook.
And that's a really important point to hear, because it means you don't have to be, you don't have to have worked for Facebook or Google. You don't have to have been a celebrity or a footballer, or you don't have to have sailed around the world in X number of days. You can create content that's really incredible and changes people's lives. And that can be your gift to give back, I guess.
And I think what's interesting about saying creating content as well is this is the other thing people get intimidated by. They're like, "Oh, I've got to do," and a big mistake I see a lot of speakers make. I've got 40 minutes. I've got to drop 40 thought bombs. And so the other mistakes I see is really smart people who've got loads of experience and loads of things to share 40 things. And again, that's crippling. By the time you get to the third or fourth thing, people have they can't cope with that sheer volume of insight.
Yeah.
So really what you've got to hone it down to is basically 1, 2, at the most 3 key messages that people take home, and you just keep bashing people over the head with that over the course of the 25 minutes. Yeah. So if you look at my videos, nothing that I say is absolutely, I don't go into any depth, but what I do is tell the same point from different angles many times. So people go, right, got that. I can see how I can use that. That's relevant to me. I can use that on Monday now, and I can take that home. And the key you really want is those points that stick with people.
And then not fill, but bring them to life with stories and anecdotes and case studies, etc. Fantastic. And then you've got the forgetting curve, which you'll know about. 80% of what you speak and say, they'll forget within, I think it's 20 minutes anyway. So there's no point, giving all that information, because they won't retain it. And that's just how the brain works. We mentioned just before we hit record, your setup at home. So my question to you is how did you transition during the pandemic to go from stage speaker in person to now virtual speaker at home potentially?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think we all faced that challenge. I was due to give a keynote on March 25th. I think the UK went into lockdown about March 20th. I can't remember exactly the exact dates, but it was a couple of days. I had 2 days notice to really do what I had to do. And it was a real challenge. I mean, I was quite fortunate in that I'm a Brit. And so a lot of my speaking, what of the people I work with have been in the US. So I've done a lot of video conferences and a lot of video training over the years. So I kind of was fairly comfortable with the transition. So I was like, yeah, I'm up for it. I'm going to try it. And yeah, I had to make that shift quite quickly. And a big part of that was, what you see around me here, which was creating a good audio experience, a good video experience. Because again, we know that it can be quite fatiguing to listen to a speaker if there's an echo or the sound's not very good. Or, I remember that first conference where the keynote speaker was kind of in the bottom corner with some headphones on in an echoey room. And it was really astonishingly difficult to listen to that person. And I was lucky I was on the next day in that conference. So it made me, I spent a bit of time overnight kind of doing a little bit of sound treatment to my room, basically, hanging some old curtains up and some clothes around me to help me get there. But yeah, really looking at the quality of audio is really is paramount. Video you can kind of get away with unless it's truly horrific, but the quality of audio has to be extremely strong if you make that transition. And that was a big lesson I learned, really, was that number one. And then there are, of course, many other lessons we can go into about brevity and types of content and what works and what doesn't, and how to approach virtual speaking versus in person, that we all kind of picked up over the course of the 2 or 3 years of lockdown.
And interestingly, it does look like we've bounced back to in person, but it does feel like there's a hybrid element that's here to stay. So it'll be interesting just to see how that plays out, I think, over the coming years.
Yeah, I think what's interesting actually, Tom, is in talking to, because again, I mentioned earlier on cultivating good relationships with event organizers. Again, through COVID, that was extremely important, because that's giving them the confidence that they can run a virtual event was key. So, getting onto, and and it also opened my world to, I spoke at a huge number of events. I spoke at loads of events in India and China. What for me is it kind of flattened the world a little bit more, where I was having to fly to San Francisco to speak, and I was all over the world with international travel, which again, to many who are starting out speaking, that sounds extremely glamorous. I've got a 3-year-old daughter. It's no longer glamorous to be doing that kind of stuff. And so it taught me a lot about reach from a virtual point of view is really important. And do you know what, now I don't take international speaking gigs anymore. I don't do it. I do some US stuff, because the thing I find with speaking, I've spoken in Hong Kong and Singapore, is you speak in Hong Kong and Singapore, do you know what happens? You get work in Hong Kong and Singapore, and that means you've got to go to Hong Kong and Singapore again.
More
and
often,
that's challenging for you if you've got to be on a different time zone and travel. So a lot about becoming more successful is strategically thinking about your geography. If you're virtual, great, and you're selling virtual products, great. But if you're doing work, you're a consultant or a coach or that kind of thing, you need to really think about and focus on where your audience is as well. And lockdown really hammered that home, definitely.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you've added a ton of value so far on this podcast. I really appreciate it. And I've got one final question, which is, if somebody just want to book you to speak or wants to find out more about you, what's the best place for them to connect with you online?
Well, I'm going to answer that with a controversial comment.
Okay.
I've given up most of my public speaking. And what was interesting is, I kind of alluded to this in the intro. And what was interesting about that is I realized what public speaking did for me and for my business. So I was a consultant. I now am a coach. Again, it's quite hard to know the difference between those two things. But for many years, I thought that speaking was the thing that got and attracted and gave me work, right? It was the speaking that meant that people hired me. And I believed that to be true. And I got to the point when my daughter was born in 2016. In 2017, I spoke at, I think, 10 international conferences. And I didn't see much of my daughter that first year of her life, because I was away traveling, right? And I believed that if I didn't do my traveling for my speaking, that was going to be the end of my career. That would be it for me. That I wouldn't get any more consulting or coaching work. And the reality was that wasn't the case. Is what speaking gives you as a coach or a consultant or a specialist or in your field is it's not a tap for work, like the work that you want to do. But what it is a way of increasing your credibility. I know, and we all
Yeah.
know that.
Mm-hmm.
But what it is, and what I find is useful for my speaking now, is I've got 3 or 4 videos of speaking at various conferences that date back about 5 or 6 years. That's all I need.
Yeah.
Because what I find these days is people introduce me and say, "Oh, you should work with Joe. You know, you're a CEO of a tech company. I'll work with Joe." And they go to my website and they watch a couple of videos of me speaking and go, "Oh, I really like what he talks about." Is there a way of reinforcing your credibility? They don't necessarily set up your credibility in the same way a book doesn't. And again, I'm a published author.
Yeah.
Is they reinforce your credibility. They aren't your credibility.
A really good point.
And that insight for me was really interesting about how I felt that my speaking was my profession. And I was a professional public speaker for a little while. The reality is it's not. And so, yeah, you can book me, but I will probably say no
Yeah.
to you
Yeah.
if you want to book me.
Mm-hmm.
My website's Mr. Joe, MRJOE.UK, mrjoe.uk. You can find me there, but I'll probably say no because, again, it's got to be a really outstanding opportunity for me to speak, to want to make that choice.
Yeah.
Really.
No, it's really, really good point, and it just kind of rounds off your journey, and it, you know, it shows that you haven't regretted doing the speaking, and you've had the benefit now, but it's not continuing to bring that benefit. So that's a really good way to round off the story. Thanks for that. And what I'll do is I'll post a link to your website in the show notes as well, in case you want to just check you out or find out more about you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks again, Joe. Really appreciate your time again, and for adding such great value to our audience.